This car was produced from 1991 to 2005. So you have basically 4 different distinct groupings of build combinations, I should say, within those 14 years. So most of us know NSXs as NA1 versus NA2. Those are the chassis codes. And really, it goes further deeper into that, and I'll explain more shortly that there are really 4 distinct year ranges or buckets that you can consider these cars in. So let me first talk about the organization, about how this video is going to be organized. I'll do my best to insert chapters as we go along here, but I'll be honest, many of these features overlap, so I may be jumping around a little bit, but I'll do my best to keep it organized as we talk through this. I'll be starting with a year by year, or at least a grouping by grouping comparison from an OEM perspective. So what was available from the factory? What are things to look out for? What are the different distinctions between the years, at least at an OEM, I should say USDM kind of spec sheet, right? So what I'll then do is I'll drill down into the more popular and more bang for the buck upgrades from an OEM standpoint. So things you can buy from Honda's parts book, or even what are some of the worthwhile aftermarket upgrades that I consider, and many of the senior NSX owners would consider high value upgrade, which many of the new owners will probably end up seeing themselves, if they really want driver's cars and they drive these things and don't just let it sit in a garage or a storage shelter, then they're going to end up buying these parts anyway, in my opinion. And I'll talk more about vendors. I'll talk more about the different shops in the different regions. I'll talk also about what are issues with like parts availability and things. So let me just touch really quickly on what I will not be discussing in this video. So like I said, grab a cup of coffee. This is going to be a long one. Pause it, get back to it later, but I suspect this will be an hour long. I won't be discussing current pricing because for all intents and purposes, especially post-COVID, pricing has really fluctuated with just about every single asset out there these days. So it wouldn't really make sense for me to put a video like this together that is essentially timeless, because they stopped building the NSX, decades ago. And basically, I want to put something out there that is pertinent to at least 2023, but I don't want to discuss pricing because we'll be all over the place when we talk about pricing. I'm going to tread very lightly on specific trims. So for example, Zanardi's, that was basically like a Type S version for the United States, the JDM Type S, the Type R, Type 0, those special edition models, I'm just going to tread lightly on. I may not even cover those topics because it really doesn't make sense for the USDM market. I'm also not going to be touching on items that maybe other videos on YouTube have already covered, such as your basic due diligence items when you're buying any car, right? If you're buying any car, you got to make sure you check it out for any crashing damage, or you want to make sure you're comfortable with the ownership history, Carfax, all those kinds of things. I'm not even going to touch on that. I'll assume you're going to do your own due diligence, and that's going to be something that's on you. All right. So let's get started. Let's get started and talk about the 4 different groupings and the different years. So let's talk about the differences between the years. And I just want to say that if I do not specify a specific market, you'll have to assume that the NSX that I'm talking about is a USDM market NSX. So okay, here we go. The first of the 4 groupings. This is going to be the 91 through 94. Then the second of the groupings will be 95 to 96. Then the third one will be 97 through 2001. And basically that'll be the last of the pop-up headlight generation. And then the very last grouping, or I should say mid-cycle refresh. This car has had several mid-cycle refreshes within the 14 years. That last grouping will be 2002 through 2005, which is 2005 was the end and the last production year for the NSX, at least in the United States. The first 2 groupings can be lumped up as NA1, which is sort of the nomenclature that many used out there. And the last 2 groupings can be lumped into NA2s. Both of those chassis codes will be NA1 and the other one will be NA2. So real quickly, again, not to confuse you with these years and numbers, but 91 through 96 is NA1. Within that grouping, there are 2 groups. 97 through 2005 is NA2, and within that, there's an additional 2 groups. So the 91 to 94, the first grouping. This is going to be the stiffest and the lightest. No power steering in any of these cars. All of them from the USDM were sold as default sort of base model with the long geared 5-speed. It came with kind of an anemic style clutch pack LSD. This LSD was good for its day, but today with high performance and very sticky tires, you may want to look into an upgrade. I'll talk more about that later. There was a factory option to order this in an automatic. So this automatic, I'm just going to touch on this right now. Any automatic that you spec for the NSX between all of the 14 years will come with a 3.0 engine. The 3.0 engine, the very first engine, and it came with detuned factory camshaft, so a little lower horsepower, and that's probably because of the automatic transmission that they use just couldn't handle maximum horsepower. And it's going to be basically the same slush box all the way through the 14 years. This first grouping, also I should say, on the automatic transmission cars, they did come with a electronic power steering. I believe the first of its kind. I'll talk more about power steering and the differences between manual and power steering and all the different modifications you can make to make it a quick ratio, etc. I'll talk more about that later in the second half of this video. The first grouping had no passenger airbags, just the driver's side. It's the most basic. It's the stiffest and the lightest chassis available in any of the years. It came with the smaller wheels and tires, so double staggered, meaning diameter was 15 inches in the front, 16 inches in the rear, and thinner tires in the front and a little bit slightly wider tires in the rear. On these years, there was the infamous snap ring versions, which was a issue with the transmission housing for these NSXs. And that really was a 91 through, I should say, mostly second half of 91 and first half of 92. Those builds were affected by potentially the snap ring issue. So it's well documented, and I honestly think by now it's kind of a nothing burger. We can touch more about that later if you have any specific questions. I should just say in general, if anyone has any specific questions about any features or individual model years, please comment down below, and I'm usually pretty good with answering those. If not, I hope some of the other NSX gurus in the community will help out and also answer those questions for you as well. The 91 through 94 ECU can be chipped and can be tuned. It was one of the more open architectures, and thank goodness we have some super smart folks in the NSX community that's able to reprogram the ECU so you can essentially factory tune it. It's still an old ECU, it's still rather slow, but for all intents and purposes, you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. The first grouping had the highest production numbers, so most of the NSXs that you'll find out there that are sold or even in owner's hands are going to be a 91 through 94 coupe. And lastly, on this first group, did not come with cup holders. Sorry guys, they didn't think about that back in 1990 when they sold this thing. The last small group of NA1 cars was a 95 through 96 year. This was kind of a transition year, primarily driven by OBD2 standards, I want to say, that were coming out and I believe had to be in place by 1996 or 97. So Honda put out these drive-by-wire electronic power steering cars that were also, for the first time ever, Targa top. So this is when, they had some learnings, they polled the community, and the community said, we want a Targa top. The car was never originally designed to be a Targa, so the added weight, 200 plus pounds of just bracing, affected the car. So in my personal opinion, don't want to hurt anyone's feelings out there, but I think this is probably the least desirable years, 95 and 96, because you did get the kind of early version of the OBD2. You got drive-by-wire, which is a little bit slow, but more so, you got the heavier chassis with a small 3.0 liter engine. 95 through 2001, that whole year, this also came with revised wheels. So you got the forged aluminum, one size bigger, 16 and 17 inch wheels, which is sort of the iconic NSX wheel, really, because that pretty much went through most of those years, and everyone at that point in time was trying to get these wheels on the earlier NSXs, I remember. This still had the long 5-speed gearbox, so it inherited that from previous years. And so let's talk about the third grouping. The third grouping is really probably the more serious mid-cycle refresh. they upped the engine displacement to a 3.0 liter engine from a 3.0, and that added about 20 horsepower as advertised. Now keep in mind that you can add about 10 or 15 horsepower to your 3.0 by just changing the exhaust package, exhaust manifold, and the exhaust muffler itself. So, and you got a lighter car. So the NA2, I think aside from the 3.2, the biggest upgrade you can get on the NA2 is really the close ratio 6-speed. So that 6-speed has shared and basically combined all of the best ratios of all the different 5-speeds that was available all around the world previous, and just combined it into one 6-speed. Close ratio 1 through 4 and a 5 and 6 cruising gear. I'll talk more about transmission upgrades. I'll reserve a special section just for transmission upgrades, because I do think it is one of the best bang for the bucks on the NSX. So that 6-speed gearbox did come with a revised helical LSD. So got rid of the kind of clutch pack style LSD on the on the earlier generations, and now there's a helical limited slip, which is pretty decent. The one thing that goes against the NA2, I should say all NA2s, as far as the 6-speed is concerned, is it came with a heavy dual mass flywheel, and they basically did this to make the car more streetable, but it's quite a heavy flywheel, and the throttle hang, or whatever you want to call it, is fairly significant in this car. The most rare of the NA2s, and especially with the pop-up headlight generation, the most rare is an NA2 coupe. All of these coupes sold into the United States came with the black rooftop, and basically the numbers they were produced, I believe they were special order only. I don't know what the official count is out there, but it's very, very low quantities. I do know a couple friends that have this, and there's even less of these sold than the Zanardis. So a very rare NA2 for you investors out there is you can snag an NA2 coupe. I think that's really kind of the big secret yet that most people don't really know about as far as NSXs. Most people want the Zanardi, which are really fetching some high numbers, and probably rightfully so. The NA2, starting with the 97, came with larger brakes. So this is really a useful upgrade, and these NA2 brakes have slightly larger rotors and slightly different front and rear bias is even still very, very competitive for today's purposes and today's use. If you get them, if you get some proper venting and proper ducting, these brakes will outperform many other cars out there. So they're still pretty good. And I would say NA2 brakes, if you just want to stop at that, they feel great. Great pedal feel, great stopping power. You know, the car's not that heavy. It just needs to get adequate cooling. Otherwise, you'll be blowing through pads. And obviously, you know, you should be using race brake fluid in there as well. Let's talk about the very last year of this first NA2 grouping, which is 2000 and 2001. In 2000, they upgraded the ABS system as well as added sort of additional smog controls associated with ULEV, ultra low emissions vehicle standards were implemented in 2000. So what ended up happening there was not only was the unrelated ABS upgraded to a much better unit, a unit that actually is more similar to a modern ABS unit, as opposed to the first generation ABS units were, just to be honest, in my opinion, they were kind of useless. Maybe for the tire technology back then and the speeds that we were traveling back then, it would have been fine. But it's really very much an analog versus digital kind of thing. And most people really underestimate the value of the NA2 2000 and up ABS upgrade. Highly recommend that. So just real quick, honorable mention for 1998 on that first group of the NA2s. There were approximately, I believe, 49 Zanardis that were built, and these were special edition sort of race spec versions. So I'm not going to go into it here because I could spend another 20 minutes going into it. If you're shopping for a Zanardi, you probably are not going to be watching this video anyway. So just note that Zanardi was a special build. They had special things like manual steering rack, much thinner. Instead of a dual pane glass rear window, it had a single pane, just stuff like that. So let's talk about the very last. Oh, Zanardi was also exclusively just a coupe as well. Much lighter chassis based on the original coupe. So I'm going to touch real quickly on just coupes in general for NA2s. As far as I know, coupes in general could have only been special ordered and were not available, at least not in the United States, or at least no one ordered them as far as I know. There was no coupe in the bubble eye or the fixed headlight version. The only ones I'm aware about were coupes that were ordered specifically for Japan, maybe even Europe, in the Type R, the Type S, or any of the different Type 0, for example. Those specs, especially the Type R, were available exclusively in just the coupe. So keep that in mind. Coupes are really, really rare as far as NSXs go in, the last 3/4 of its production cycle. So lastly, let's talk about the 02 to 05. This was the last major facelift. The very last groupings ended 2005. You got the, controversial but arguably much better quality headlights. For the first time ever, you got the xenon HIDs in there. The quality of the screen is really good, so you get a nice even light beam pattern. You got a revised front bumper, you got a revised hood, front fenders, actually all the fenders stayed the same. You got a revised rear bumper lower fascia, which is called the valence, and revised interior. For the first time, you had more choices that were not just the ivory or black or tan. You got a choice of basically a bunch of other colors. So you can get a blue NSX in Laguna Seca, Long Beach blue pearl, and you can get a matching blue interior for that. Or an Imola orange NSX and get a matching orange interior. These ones, my favorite. These things look spectacular when trimmed that way, in my personal opinion. The later years of this, you did have a 6-speed that was revised with dual synchros, so slightly more robust in that way. The dual synchros is probably not a huge game changer as far as 6 speeds are concerned, but it is slightly more desirable. You can retrofit earlier 6-speed with the dual synchros with buying the right parts. And lastly, on these last grouping, the last grouping of the NSX 02 to 05, the factory did sell them with the 17-inch, so single stagger, 17-inch, 17-inch, 215, 255 cross-section wheels and tires in the BBS-made forged aluminum wheels. So super rad. A set just sold for like $7,500 off of Bring a Trailer. I really think they look great. And there's imitations of these wheels out there, but definitely no one has gone to imitate the actual original sizing. So the imitations are coming in at like a wider and different offset 17-17, and some of them, actually many of them, are 17 and 18 in a dual stagger with the same overall look. I can't say that these replicas look exactly the same. The spokes are kind of altered a little bit, but for the most part they pass as replicas. I just want to mention some quick notes. All of the coupes for all of the years, I believe I said it before, has the black roof. In Japan, you could order them custom painted. I'm not sure if you were able to order that here in the United States custom painted. So for you guys out there looking for like pristine original examples, keep that in mind. The Targa tops, all of them, as far as the roof line is concerned, that all came body colored. All automatics were a factory option for all years, and like I said earlier, all automatics had a detuned 3.0 liter engine. And lastly, an automatic to manual transmission swap can be fairly expensive. It can be probably as much as, as low as $10,000. If you get all the right parts, you have a bunch of buddies that are willing to give you parts, to as high as something like $25,000. So just keep that in mind. So let's do something a little bit fun. Let's talk about, for example, if you had all four of these I'm going to call them generations. I know it's not really the right term for it, but if you had all four of these generations in your garage and you had all the money in the world, but you only had OEM parts available to you, how would you make the perfect NSX by drawing all these different parts from these four different groups? So I think this is a kind of a fun thought exercise, and let me just kind of tell you my viewpoint after owning this car for so many years. I think the perfect NSX that you can build as far as like an OEM plus or whatever is going to be the following. So again, this is a premise of you being able to have access to all the different parts from all the Honda NSX catalogs, from JDM, European, USDM, etc., right? But purely, let's stick with OEM Honda parts for now. I would first start with the lightest. Find a coupe, find a 91 to 94 coupe, get your cost basis as low as possible, at least going into it. I would take that 3.0 liter, you don't even need the 3.2, take that 3.0 liter and swap out the headers. So swap it out to a lightweight set of long tube headers. A bunch of manufacturers out there, I did a couple videos on them in this channel. Swap out to a lightweight exhaust. That exhaust is super heavy. It was designed for sound restriction and et cetera, et cetera. So you'll gain, as far as power to weight ratio, you'll gain so much by just doing those on the 3.0. It'll even be faster than a 3.2 NA2 NSX by just doing that. I would switch to and try to find, they're like pretty much unobtainium these days, but if you can find a 6-speed transmission, the ultimate transmission for the NSX in my opinion, then you get the choice of, which we'll go into more later, you can get a choice of updating the final drive on that. If you can't find a 6-speed transmission, by all means have your 5-speed rebuilt with either the short gears or the full-on Type R spec, which is a short gears and a 4.23 final drive. I would definitely swap out into either the Type R newer 2000 and up version ABS unit, or just any newer 2000 and up version, just standard NSX ABS unit. I run a standard NSX ABS unit. I've tracked my car. I've ran different kinds of tire compounds. They're just fine. But evidently there's actually a part number difference between the R as opposed to the standard unit, and I'm not going to go into that's really get into the weeds on the minor details. I probably personally would not suggest doing the S2000 upgrade, but that's becoming popular out there just purely because of the price. But know that the tuning for the S2000 ABS, as far as brake bias is concerned, is really for an S2000, not the NSX. I would personally do a fixed headlight swap, and that is purely for function. I know there are a lot of NSX guys out there that have the romantic attachment to the pop-up headlights. Don't blame you guys, but from a pure functionality standpoint, it's like 25 pounds or more heavier with all the mechanisms and the actuators, etc. It is significantly heavier than the fixed headlight version. So you'll save a lot of weight, you'll get much better optics, and also when the lights are on, much better aerodynamic flow. I would also upgrade to all of the basically 2002 and up NSX-R chassis bracing. Those are actually quite good. They are minimalistic but easy to install, and they put them in the right spots. I would also upgrade and remove the factory airbag steering wheel and put fixed, kind of like a Momo style or OMP style steering wheel in there. And that is really because I personally feel that the NSX stock steering wheel is a little bit muted and dampened. It's also a large diameter one. So everything about a factory stock, bone stock NSX all the years, whether it's EPS or manual steering, came with a very, very, very slow, maybe just one vary, not a bunch of varies, but a very slow ratio rack. So I'll go into more of that in a little bit. I might consider a Type S or a Type R suspension package. Again, keeping it stock. I think it's much better to go coilover aftermarket, but keeping with the ethos of this exercise, I would keep it as that. I would go with all the Type R Aero package, all the Type R Aero bits. Those are very effective. They don't look crazy out there, but they are effective. And in Honda terms, instead of saying it produces downforce, they say it produces zero lift, which I love that. And lastly, I would also upgrade much of the interior. So bucket seats alone, removing the factory OEM leather adjustable seats saves a bunch of weight. And you take those out, you put in your choice of aftermarket bucket seat. I can go into more about the challenges with installing that, but it is possible. saves a bunch of weight by going bucket seats. For example, my car, just my personal car, after modifying it for so long, I have a full interior, full AC, even have a pneumatic lift kit for the front axle that I designed way back when. It's still under 2,650 pounds. So you're easily under 2,700 pounds with these upgrades. And a car that has 300 horsepower with such a low overall weight, it's a blast to drive. So that would be basically my perfect NSX if all I had was the OEM Honda parts book, parts catalog. So next topic, let's talk about common maintenance items. But before I go into and talking about the common maintenance items, let's first talk about parts availability, vendors, and repair shops out there for the NSX. The NSX, I feel, has a reputation, maybe correct, maybe not, but there is a group of people that feel that, oh, it's just a Honda, anyone can work on it, it's no big deal, it's like your Civic. Then there's another camp that will say, no, it's an exotic, it's a mid-engine, it's significantly different enough from a Civic that, it needs an engine out for everything. The truth is, as far as service is concerned, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. The NSX is still a bespoke chassis for Honda. They have very few shared parts amongst all the other Honda models of that generation. So for all intents and purposes, it's still rather bespoke. And the way the shops have sort of blossomed from this ownership group is you do have quite a few pretty much NSX only specialists out there, especially here in California. I hope someone can weigh in on other markets like the Midwest or even the Rocky Mountains or the East Coast even, because I'm not an expert in those areas, but there are specific regional experts and regional repair shops that are sort of known to be NSX specific and have a really good reputation. So I'll just talk about California real quick, and specifically Southern California and even north, just the Southwest in general, like Arizona. So in NorCal, there's a couple of shops that I'm aware of. Greenlight has worked on NSXs. Track Spec has worked on NSXs. There's also another shop, one of the OG shops, which is Shad over at Driving Ambition in the Sacramento area. And as far as Southern California, these are my go-to shops as I'm in Southern California. My go-to shops would be HQ Engineering. They're in San Gabriel Valley. There's actually quite a few. I'm not going to mention them because I've just, heard not so great things about some of these other ones. But there's one that I also trust, which is Nick at Applied Motorsports. And let's see, Ramon at Nigel Motors over in Orange County. So those are probably the three go-tos that I would be shipping my cars to personally if I'm not working on them myself at home. So real quickly, I'll touch on the vendors. The vendors in the NSX community, again, you guys got to keep in mind that this is a relatively low production vehicle. It's a fairly niche vehicle. So you're not really going to have parts available from big tuners like Cobb or, there were some aftermarket like Dynan who dabbled into it. You'll really have these very small, very specific NSX vendors that probably just focus on that chassis and one or two others. Science of Speed comes to mind. Actually, just finishing on the shop list that I would recommend folks to. We Don't Lift, Ravi over there in Arizona, in Phoenix area, is a great shop to go to if you need NSX work. Science of Speed, they do good work. Probably on the higher end of pricing, but the quality speaks for itself with Science of Speed. They're also a vendor as well. They make NSX specific parts, probably one of the more well-known ones. Driving Ambition makes NSX specific parts here in Sacramento. And there's a few other NSX specific shops that I would purchase. Oh, Cedar Ridge Fabrication in Oregon. Cedar Ridge Fabrication produces a lot of quality suspension parts for NSXs. I don't want to go into other vendors who have had kind of maybe a little bit of a questionable reputation. Many of them are really great. I commend all NSX vendors for getting out there and pursuing a owner base that's really rather quite small and niche. So kudos to you guys. for helping us and keeping the community alive with parts and great parts as well as replacement parts. Just a shout out and a thank you to y'all. And so that's just a quick word on parts, vendors, and maintenance shops. If I missed anyone, I apologize. I'm sure we will get to them in the comments. One more thing about parts availability, and this has kind of changed throughout the years, especially recently in the last handful of years. Parts availability, I'm not going to lie, it is getting difficult and just seems like it keeps getting more difficult for the NSX. I don't know if necessarily this is COVID driven, because pre-COVID there were already parts that were getting discontinued. For example, if you wanted to go and put together a 6-speed from scratch, right? Like you wanted to go into the parts book and you wanted to order every single 6-speed part out there, there's 1 or 2 parts that have been discontinued. So you can't even find them, like a shift forks, for example. So it's virtually impossible to put something together. You can maybe repair something, but if you have an issue with the 5 and 6 shift forks, until that gets brought back into production, which we don't know if it's ever going to come back, that's going to have to be, milled from CNC aftermarket somehow, some way. So there are issues with parts availability, and it's starting to get worse. For the most part, at least my experience, I've been able to order pretty much everything by using the Japanese vendors. Japanese vendors including Amayama, Impex, and there's another one, I believe it was Greenlight. I'll post these in the comments below on the ones that I use, but there are several out there that folks use for NSX parts. And then, like I said, a new thing is going straight to Japan, because the US Acura dealerships, oftentimes they won't have the inventory, no matter which warehouse you go to in the United States. All right, let's talk about common maintenance items and tuning modifications for the NSX platform. On the tuning side, I feel this is really where I can add some value. I can share with y'all my experience with, really pushing this chassis to the limits, at least from a, amateur or unprofessional, I'm just a wannabe engineer standpoint and just a guy in a garage. I like to really push the limits of the chassis, and most often than not, I would go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, just trying to find that edge and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. So let's just talk about something. Oh, one more thing I'm not going to touch on in this video, guys. It's really about like stancing your car, or making it look good for car shows, or slamming it, because I'll be honest, that is not where I'm any good at. I notice quite a lot of cars on Instagram, trying to chase the clout, getting just quite an unreal amount of hits. So props to you guys. I don't have that kind of taste. I'm actually pretty awful at stancing a car, so I accept that. This is not what this video is going to be about, and I'm just not any good at it, so I'm not going to touch on those things at all. Common maintenance items. All right, let's get into the meat and potatoes of maintenance items. Probably the first one is the snap ring, right? So 91 through 92, in that the middle years, second half of 91, first half of 92, you had the snap ring issue with the snap ring ranges. I'll be honest, by now it's been kind of a nothing burger. I haven't heard any news about snap ring items, simply for the fact that most NSX owners drive their cars, and by now, if you have a snap ring transmission and it hasn't gone out on you, or you haven't addressed it preemptively, those cars are probably super low mileage. They still stashed away. They'll probably never, ever, ever really get driven enough or hard enough for snap ring issues to show themselves. So if you're shopping for a 91 or 92 NSX and it's within the quote-unquote snap ring range and you don't know any history about it, I'm going to guess, especially if it's high mileage, so 60,000 miles, or I would say the higher the mileage for this topic, the better. So if you're at like 120, for example, or over 100, huge chance that transmission's already been addressed. All right, so I would be fine buying a car that is of high mileage in those snap ring years. However, if you do want to, further on in this video, I'm going to talk about the different transmission upgrades that you can make on the car. If you do want to make the transmission upgrades, a 91 or 92 might be a great candidate, because if you do find one that's a snap ring issue, then you're going to want to crack it open anyway and start changing a bunch of gears and a bunch of parts in it. You might as well include a new top cover, which addresses the snap ring problem. All right, so that's a little bit about the snap ring. The CCU instrument cluster. So I'm going to group these next couple things into what I'm going to call like electronic problems, okay, with the car. The car's 30 years old. You're going to have issues with capacitors blowing out in these circuit boards. You're going to have issues with traces burning themselves out, corroding, whatever. But keep in mind that any kind of electrical issue, especially the dashboard, is now turning out to be a fire hazard. So some of these cars just sitting on a tender have spontaneously combusted. Thankfully, I believe the owner community has gotten to these pretty quick. So I've maybe counted 5, as far as I know, that's been publicly posted that have kind of caught up in flames, needing a new dashboard. And I believe one of them took out the whole car, or at least the front clip of the whole car. But this is going to include your climate control unit, aka CCU. It's going to include your SRS airbag module, which sits underneath the radio. It's going to include, most obviously, your dashboard, or I should say your instrument cluster. That instrument cluster is known to have leaky capacitors as well as the CCU. And our go-to guy to send these things to is Brian K. You'll find him on NSX Prime under that username, Brian K. He's a great guy, been doing this for the community for more than a decade. He refurbishes these units and is really good and very, very reasonably priced in doing so. So the other electronic problem that these cars often experience is the Bose sound system. So unfortunately, there's still no real go-to person to replace these Bose sound systems. So there is a gentleman in Europe who I think is starting to dabble into fixing these Bose sound systems. And really, the head unit is the first thing that goes out, but also I've heard of the individual amplifiers in these Bose enclosures, because this car has 3 different speaker enclosures, 2 in the door and 1 in passenger footwell, which is your micro subwoofer. There's also 1 speaker behind the center console here. It's kind of like a center channel speaker. So those things need to be rebuilt somehow, some way. There seems to be no consensus on what exactly on the Bose head unit goes out. It's been sort of a handful of different things. So I'll just leave that up to you guys. If you still want to use your factory head unit, which in many cases, guys, I would probably just toss out and convert to, not toss out, but remove it, put it in the storage bin, put some, decandescent little baggies around it so you can dehumidify it, and just mothball it, and get something like a Bluetooth transceiver so you can run music from your phone. The early generation NSXs, the 3.0s, they had the paper head gaskets. So these paper head gaskets are notorious for going out if the car is overheated. So make sure you keep an eye on that. The replacements these days are MLS gaskets, and they've proven to be really, really great. So if you're going to do an engine out service, and again, I'm going to talk more into some of the other common maintenance items, but if you're going to do an engine out service, definitely you might as well do the head gasket and remove that paper head gasket out of there. Don't risk a head gasket blowing from, an overheating situation. Some of the things you want to address while the 3.0 engine is maybe out of the car and you're doing a big maintenance job on it. And if you go to somewhere like HQ Engineering, they're very, very reasonable in price. They can do an engine out service for you for, not that much money. I'm not going to quote because I don't actually know myself. I just know that they're really reasonable because I've heard numbers floating around. They're great. If you're going to do an engine out service, get the timing belt water pump service, because if the timing belt goes on this car, it's an interference engine. It is really, really expensive. And one of the discontinued items for this car is the block itself. A 3.0 block, Honda, as far as I know, doesn't sell them anymore. So you can't find these blocks anywhere. You have to buy used ones. The timing belt, the head gasket, the water pump, all the coolant hoses, there's like maybe just shy of 40 coolant hoses in this car. All of them needs to get swapped every few years. Make sure that's getting done. The ABS module, like I said earlier, a older ABS module should probably be swapped to a newer one, or you can consider doing like an ABS delete. I hate ABS deletes. I'm not that good of a driver. I always flat spot my tires driving aggressively. So the ABS version 2 or the 2000 and up ABS is a really worthwhile upgrade in my opinion. The early ABSs, you can sort of lengthen its life a little bit by doing like, sort of minor overhaul procedures, changing the seals on those solenoids, going through and like doing like a prime and a cleanup of the fluid with the special tool thing. It is a mess. I don't even suggest you go there. The only reason, in my opinion, that anyone would want to preserve the original sort of dinosaur, like archaic ABS is because you want to keep the car super original. But for all intents and purposes, from a functional standpoint, that thing is junk. Get rid of it. Cooling, like I said, the coolant hoses, but also the radiator. So I'll talk more about, if you want to just go back to OEM spec, OEM radiator is fine. I'll go more into that later, but there are some really, really good aftermarket ones available. Brakes. So these days, if you're going to keep either the NA1 smaller brakes or the NA2 slightly larger brakes, by now you're going to want to get those calipers rebuilt. So Honda does sell a rebuild kit for that, new seals, etc., that you can do for those brakes. Steering racks on these cars go out pretty often. It's one of the major ones that does need to get refurbished, but because it's not like a crucial fix, you can still drive a car with a worn out steering rack. But in the manual steering racks, you start to get a knock or a play in the steering rack. So you can either replace it with a brand new one, which is my recommendation, or for these manual racks, there's also a great shop, another NSX vendor. They go by NSX Rack Repair. They can refurbish the internals of the rack for you. I'll go more into about the different racks that you can choose a little bit further on in the video, because there are some options out there for aftermarket. The EPS racks, electronic power steering racks on these NSXs, go out much more than the manual steering racks. What ends up happening is, I believe the torque sensor on it goes bad, so it starts to feel really odd when you're turning the wheel. Maybe at like some degrees it will actually assist, and in some cases it'll turn itself off. So or it even has some play. So the EPS racks on these cars are a very common refurbished item. So you could either send it to NSX Rack Repair. They're the only ones I know that will refurbish these, new bushings, new electronics, etc. Or you can upgrade to what I did, which is the S2000 electronic power steering rack quick ratio. I'll go more about that later. Bushings. So suspension bushings on this car, surprisingly, they're made out of some magic rubber. They don't really go out. I have seen several damaged ones, but I'm not sure if that's user error or users trying to replace them. But suspension bushings is not a common thing, but it does happen, so look into that. The door seals around the door, since these doors are pillarless windows, they do wear out a little bit more just from like rubbing and everything. Window regulators. Window regulators is a common fix-it item on this NSX. Like I said, because they're pillarless, a lot more going on with the mechanism at the bottom. The frame doesn't have really great support, so it's a lot of stress, in my opinion, on the rails, which is in the door itself. And also the grease gets really old and sticky and gross. So in my opinion, it's kind of a pain in the ass job, to be honest. There's not much access if you've got bigger hands in there, but that's one of the items that does get replaced. I personally, even though I was probably one of the first ones in the country to promote and bring in the aftermarket rebuild kits for these window regulators, I can't say, looking back, and again, guys, this was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when most of us old NSX owners had Honda Civic budgets and we're trying to just skimp money everywhere. These days, I would suggest your time is probably better spent buying an original OEM window regulator replacement. That's my go-to. I have two sitting in my garage. I'm dreading the day I have to replace them, but I do need to replace them at some point. The AC, air conditioning blower assembly, which sits in the middle of the dash, inside underneath the dash, which is a lot of work to remove. You got to drop the steering column, you got to take out the whole entire dashboard, take out the center console assembly, etc., just to get to the blower motor. The blower motor itself, I don't know of any of them that have stopped working, but because the NSX does not have a in-cabin filter, it just the components and everything in it collects a lot of dirt and grime and just kind of like gross things. So it's a very common item to get refurbished, and there's a gentleman in the East Coast that sells a refurb kit, or you could send your whole entire blower assembly to him and he will rebuild it for you. Things like, the foam padding that insulates the different flaps, those disintegrate. Like, you can just look at it and it'll disintegrate. Those get replaced. While you have your engine out, it would really be a great time to do your LMAs, which are lost motion assemblies. These are little like hydraulic tappets that go underneath the cams, and those things start to make a lot of noise, like a lot of clicking noises when they start to seize or get old. They're not really detrimental to the motor, but it does start to make noise, and people wonder if you need a valve adjustment. But even with a proper valve adjustment and your LMAs are going out, you want to switch those out into the non-hydraulic versions, which I think are from the B series, but there is a very popular upgrade for that, and that requires an engine out. The heads have to come off. The heads don't have to come off, but the cams have to come off. So while you're doing that, might as well change the cam seals. But if you're gonna do that, you might as well take the whole heads out completely and put MLS head gaskets in there. The coolant tank. So the coolant tank, in my opinion, is underrated. I feel that there's several folks that would go into, these super strong aluminum or metal coolant tanks. But in my opinion, I do really, really like the factory coolant tank. The factory coolant tank is made out of some kind of plastic resin, but it is baffled, which is great. And also it is designed in such a way that it will be the first thing in your cooling system to leak if pressures get too high. So in my opinion, that's a great fuse. You want that to be the weakest point. It's super easy to spot. It is easy to get to, it's easy to replace, and in my opinion, you want that as the weakest point in your cooling system. You don't want to have a high pressure cooling system out there, at least in my opinion, that could affect head gaskets or could affect, any given one of those 40 hoses that could leak or break or whatnot. Last couple things that come to mind as far as common maintenance items on the NSX are your brake master cylinder, your clutch master cylinder, and the slave cylinder. Those are ones that go out every few years. You'll notice if one's going out because it'll be leaky either by the brake booster or it'll be leaky behind the pedals in the interior going into the cabin. So those are probably the last bits of maintenance items that I can think of. All right, guys, let's go into a very fun topic. Let's now talk about modifications to your NSX. And the reason why I'm making a video specifically on modifications is not only, all these years of knowledge in my brain and having tried so many different things. I've been through 4 transmissions, for example, just trying different setups. Really, the majority of the NSXs you're going to find out there that are worth buying have probably been lightly to heavily modified. That's just the way it is with the car. That's the way the community has always been. A bunch of Honda gearheads are tinkerers by nature, in my opinion, and there's a large majority of that ownership group in the NSX platform. So let's talk about modifications. I'm going to touch on what I think is going to be the best bang for your buck, even though it's quite an expensive modification. But if you have a USDM car, 3.0 or 3.2, but really I'm going to be specifically focusing on the 3.0 because it's the most out there right now, is going to come with the long gears from the USDM market. It's a very long 1, 2, 3, and 4 gears. And really, there are 4 different OEM specs that you can go with in terms of just dropping something in there, okay? So the first one is obviously going to be our USDM factory one. Then you're going to have the JDM short gear, just like standard, run-of-the-mill JDM transmission. This is going to be the same final drive as the USDM, which is 4.06, but you get the short gears installed, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4th gears. 5th gear is the same for all generations of 5 speeds, but you're going to have a shorter and quicker ratio 1 through 4. So for example, the USDM upper limit of the 2nd gear is something like 81 or 82 miles an hour, right? Very similar to like a Porsche GT4 having super long gears. Not great, not the most fun, just quite long. The JDM 2nd gear, for example, tops out somewhere around 65 miles an hour, which is much more usable. You get to throw around the gears more, acceleration is better, closer ratio, etc. So in my opinion, for example, if you're like a track goer and you don't like to be too busy shifting and you want to sort of optimize your speeds and your shifting in that fashion, you'll be very fast with a JDM 5-speed. Now, another way to configure your 5-speed is to add a shorter final drive. So the factory OEM Type R has a 4.23 final drive. This final drive is the cheapest kind of short final drive you can go with because it bolts on directly to the factory LSD, limited slip differential. So you can just get the ring gear and the pinion gear and the oil gear. Oh, sorry, ring gear, input shaft, and the oil gear. And I believe those 3 items and a few other things will get you into a shorter final drive. This is my go-to. That is probably what I think is the best combination 5-speed at the expense of having your 5th gear run a little bit higher RPM in general when you're cruising. So for example, I'm going by memory here, but if you're going 75 miles an hour, I think you're somewhere around like 35 or 3600 RPM, somewhere around there. So that is sort of the only downside to having a short gear Type R 5-speed. You can also, now there's a great option, which is a wave track differential. I was one of the first ones to test these on the NSX. I actually love it. It's a great combination of having a streetable car that, it's sort of a modified Torsen, so to speak. But you can read more about Wave Track. They're an aftermarket company. Do some research on it. But I really like my Wave Track in my 6-speed, which I'll go more into later. And you can install these on a 6-speed or a 5-speed. And it's really it's not that expensive. But there's also 2 other LSD vendors out there that I'm aware of, which is ATS. So ATS has the ATS and OS Geekend. They're kind of the, old school vendors for these. They've always sold them through all the years. They've always been the go-to for performance-oriented LSDs. But, ATS, for example, makes a carbon disc one, which I've yet to try. But the metal disc, really highly configurable OS Geekend LSD is a little bit noisy on the street. So even though it's highly configurable, you can do a 1-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 or a 2.0-to-1 like configuration. It is highly configurable, highly tunable, but it is noisy on the street. So as you're making turns, it goes snap, 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 honk, honk, honk. They make like all sorts of weird noises when you're just kind of running around. So it didn't really bother me, but now that I have the Wave Track, it's been rather pleasant not having those noises. So you can get those in a 4.4. You can get those in a stock final drive ratio or a more popular 4.4 final drive ratio. So 4.4 again is going to be a little bit shorter than your 4.23, but 4.4 is going to be shorter and you'll be even, quicker shifting at that point. So to me, in my mind, if you really want a LSD, but don't want to spend on short gears, for example, then a USDM transmission with a 4.4 might be kind of interesting because you're closening up the ratio of those long gears, but then you have the 4.4 there to kind of shorten things up and bring them closer together at the expense of having a very high RPM 5th gear. So, all of these have pros and cons. Let's talk about the 6-speed. Sort of the unobtainium, the best one to get in my opinion, if you can find them out there. The 6-speed transmission, you can configure it in what I think is 3 or 4. Oh, you know what? Before I go into that, there's actually a more rare, I believe it was made available by Comtech, like a 4.6 final drive. There's a few owners out there that have it. In my mind, a 4.4 is way too short for me already. I prefer a 4.23. But if you want a 4.6, gosh, I believe there's out there. If you post a want to buy ad on NSX Prime, I'm sure someone will have one in his garage somewhere to be willing to sell you. So, okay, let's go to the 6-speed. I'm so sorry. I know this video is going so long, but let's just stick with it. Hopefully it's useful for you guys. The 6-speed, ultimate transmission in my opinion. The downsides of the 6-speed is it's not going to be as strong as a 5-speed if you are really into like high horsepower, forced induction builds. The 6-speed has kind of within the same footprint, within the same roughly exterior packaging, they're trying to squeeze an additional gear in there. So everything had to come just a slightly bit smaller. So the individual gears are thinner, they're going to be slightly weaker. So I may not recommend a 6-speed if you've got really high horsepower out there, but I've seen 600, 700 horsepower cars handle the 6-speed. But the 5-speed is sort of your go-to for high horsepower cars. So okay, let's talk about 6-speed. 6-speed, you can get them in 3 different ways. You can get the OEM 6-speed, which has a 4.06 final drive. All 6-speeds sold in all of the world were all the same as far as ratios are concerned, except for the Type R. You can get a Type R with the same 4.23 final drive. And all the 6-speed had 1 and 4 were close ratios, with the 5 and 6 being your overdrives. The 6-speed, the ultimate one that I eventually built, is a 6-speed with a 4.23 final drive. So you get that, quicker 1 through 5, 1 through 4 shifting close gear ratio, and you also get a long cruising gear in the 6th gear. So with the 4.23, you're even bringing those gears just marginally closer together in terms of closeness of the ratios. So you get additional more shifting action with that. And the 4.23 isn't going to be as busy as like a 4.4, which OS Geek and ATS still sell for the NSX. So my ultimate transmission that I have, and it's one that is going to stick in my car forever, I have no plans of ever changing it, is a 6-speed with the 4.23 and the wave track. So that's sort of been the ultimate for me. Let's see, what else would you want to know more about the 6-speed? Oh, transmissions. If you do have an NA2 on a 97 and up, if you have a stock NA2, by all means, the best mod you can do is to yank out that really heavy dual mass flywheel and go with any one of the few vendors that sell an NA2 single disc. Again, the earlier years for 3.0s, they had a twin disc, which is a great transmission, or a great clutch for stock, and it can hold stock horsepower. It can't really hold much more than that. It's the only downside. But you can swap that into a 6-speed by changing the input shaft of the 6-speed itself to the Type R version. I know it's a little complicated, but you can spend a little bit of money, crack open that 6-speed, swap out the input shaft, then you'll be able to run any twin disc clutch out there, which, guys, in terms of vendors, there are very, very few, less than a handful of vendors that actually sell a replacement clutch that's designed for a single disc. You'll get many more options out there if you have a 6-speed by being able to use the twin disc clutch assembly of the earlier generations, which a little bit more than a handful of aftermarket companies sell clutches for a twin disc. Hopefully that made sense. It gets a little bit more complicated with talking about transmissions, but that's basically, for the most part, what I would do with an NSX is start with the transmission. A short geared NSX with a bone stock engine with just intake headers and exhaust is phenomenal. It really matches the chassis quite well. Okay, so let's talk about engine modifications. Now, engine modifications, I'm going to tread on this pretty lightly, but for the most part, the 3.0 liter engines lend itself better to engine modifications. You can bore the block bigger if you want. Keep in mind that the NSX from the factory, as far as the engines are concerned, they were super stout, super well balanced, really, really well put together, that throughout my 15 years, built motors have a much, much, much higher tendency to go bad. We don't yet really know what the reasons are, but it really comes down to your engine builder having to be super meticulous with balancing and measuring out the bores and measuring out the tolerances and those types of things, where if they're just sort of putting together a build and not doing that extra due diligence step, there's a good chance your motor is going to get bad. It might be fine at the dyno, might do these things, but the lifespan of a built motor has been pretty short in my experience. With that said, having a built motor in the NSX is really, really a ton of fun. It's kind of the ultimate. There are several stroker kits that are built for the car, or you can keep it stock and go low compression and do a forced induction setup with forged pistons, things like that. I'm gonna not go so heavily into this. Just keep in mind that once you start going into an engine build, there are very few engine builders, in my opinion, that can actually do it right. So, okay, as far as stock engine power is concerned, the original motor, stock for stock, 3.0 versus 3.2. The 3.0 responds really well to header changes. So header and exhaust responds really well, 10-15 horsepower to the wheels, no problem, as long as you get a good set. Intake, not so much. The intake for the NSX was actually done pretty well. If you're trying to make more power and thinking that you're going to get more than 5 horsepower by swapping out an intake, really the only intake that has shown to prove any kind of power upgrade is an ITV, or obviously forced induction. most of the aftermarket like cone filters out there that are being sold are open air, so they suck in a bunch of hot air from the cabin, from the engine cabin, and not ideal. If you're going to get an open air, a higher flowing air filter, make sure it's vented from the passenger side wheel well and it's kind of covered off well. As I said earlier, the weakness of the stock block is going to be the paper head gaskets in the early years. But many of these cars, regardless of what year, were force inducted with the Comtech supercharger that was actually sold and installed by most Acura dealers at the time. So that's a common upgrade for that. I made many more videos about the supercharger system. If you're interested in that, you can look into some of my older videos about the supercharger system and sort of what you need to do to get there. A stock motor with stock internals can do pretty much up to 350 to 400 horsepower to the wheels safely. 400 is kind of pushing it, but I've seen pretty reliable engines go 400. I've certainly beat mine up going 350 force inducted, and it still had amazing compression numbers and leak down tests, even when I pulled off the blower. The 3.2 doesn't lend itself well to like boring and things of that sort, because it had what's called the fiber reinforced metal, or FRM, cylinder coating, which Porsches have and things like that, which you really isn't meant to be bored. But I'm not even sure if you can even sleeve the 3.2s. You might be able to. So that's kind of it on engine modifications. Let's talk real briefly about steering racks. The NSX has a pretty slow steering rack from the factory. Let's talk about the manual steering racks first. So manual steering racks have somewhere like a progressive, somewhere between a 20-to-1 to an 18-to-1. It's a progressive rate steering rack. So very slow, quite heavy, but in the right conditions, a factory manual rack is sublime. It is really, really amazing on the chassis. Now, when you hear folks, I want to sort of caveat this from a longtime owner's point of view, and why I eventually went with a electronic power steering rack with a faster ratio from an S2000. Okay, the electronic racks, or I should say, the manual racks on the NSX is amazing until you have to drive quickly, or I should say, if you're exposed to really tight turns, the steering rack gets pretty cumbersome because it is very slow, so you require much more rotations for any given steering angle, and it does get a little bit tiring. Not only that, but if you're gonna recover from a spin, there's a much higher chance that you won't have the muscle power to recover from a spin, and also it could, take an arm out. That thing pushes a lot of torque through that steering wheel, especially if you're running super sticky tires, wider tires, etc. So that brings me to the NA2 factory EPS, electronic power steering. The only downside, in my opinion, to the EPS is not so much that it's a little bit void of feel. That's not really my issue with it, but it is that it is still slow. It still has like an 18-to-1 ratio or something along those lines, and it's still quite slow. If only they just made it a little bit faster, I would have went ahead and upgraded to an NA2 steering rack. But it's slow, it's devoid of feel, so I think it is the worst case scenario in terms of available steering racks out there to swap. Let me touch real quickly on the manual racks, and one of the modifications an owner has gone through and did a group buy on. And I think this is kind of an interesting modification. It's not something that I wanted to do, but Quaif, one of the owners from the group, Ben, shout out to Ben, he went ahead and commissioned a small batch of quick ratio manual rack and pinion replacement. So it is a heavier feel, but it is a quicker ratio. So if you're into that and you're Hercules, then by all means look into that. I do believe NSX Rack Repair has maybe like a handful of units to sell, and I don't think Quaif is ever going to run another batch of these unless you do another order of whatever it was, 20 or 50 minimum order quantity. So going back to my modifications and what I did is I went with a power steering rack from a gentleman who put together a kit. His name is Dave. Shout out to you, Dave. By the way, shout out to John, who does all the ECU upgrades and keeps me occupied on chat when I got questions. So shout out to you as well. But let's talk about the electronic power steering upgrade for the NSX using a JDM NSX rack. So the reason why you have to use a JDM rack is because you got to flip the rack the other way, because the S2000 rack is in front of the axle, as opposed to the NSX is in the back of the axle. So you do need a JDM unit for this. You can use any of the Honda Accord units, which are sort of an in-between ratio. I think 16:1, a little bit sort of more relaxed driving feel. But in my opinion, I went with the AP1, which is the quickest ratio, something like 13 point something to 1, which is the same as the Club Racer or S2000 CR ratio. And I put that on my NSX. I think it's a great balance. You still have feel, not going to be as scrumptious as your manual, but you do have quite a bit of chassis control. It's much easier to point and place the car, and the quick ratio with the longer wheelbase of the NSX as opposed to an S2000. I've had 3 S2000s. I know how they feel. A little bit too twitchy for my flavor, but if you stick that steering rack with that ratio in an NSX, I feel that with the longer wheelbase, it does balance a car out really well, especially if you have aggressive and good suspension on the car. So just my 2 cents on that. Okay, let's talk about another big topic, suspension. Suspension on the NSX, from a stock point of view, was really well designed in terms of it having obviously double wishbones on all 4 corners, but it was originally designed at a ride height and a wheel and tire package for whatever was available, and sort of the ethos back then with being not very sticky tires and a lot of body roll. So the NSX, with using modern rubber, modern dampers, or modern dampening, I should say, you're able to lower the car more, but at the consequence of having basically bad roll center. So that's the one sort of bummer about the NSX, because it wasn't designed for a ride height to be so low that, a lot of the folks out there who are stancing their cars, they're gonna drive fine to and from the show, or if you're going to a Cars and Coffee, but if you're gonna drive those cars aggressively, the rear roll center especially can get away on you. So if you're not familiar with what roll center issues are, basically it's when you lower the car and you push the roll center, or you push the center of gravity so far down below the control arms, and the control arm starts to creep up like that, then it starts to want to throw itself and lift in the rear or the front, depending on which side we're talking about, and you get that kind of floaty feeling as the car's weight shifts. So kind of that pit of your stomach, floaty feeling that the rear end's about to get away from you. That's what bad roll center does on the NSX platform. You can mitigate a lot of that with a stiff front sway bar and really, really good dampers, which I would start with. Probably the lowest level damper I would go with personally on any NSX would be the KWV3s. It's well tuned for the car. Then the Öhlins DFVs are starting to also become popular. That's just been made more available in the last handful of years. I went with a JRZ setup. Very happy with mine. And also you can go with other ones that have also been recently more popular, is MCS. MCS makes a suspension package for the NSX. One of the vendors put something out for it. And also, you do have the more